So there are new people listening each and every month, which is fantastic in both our markets, Halifax and Ottawa. So I think it's important that you kind of let everybody know, those new listeners, a bit about you and what you do. Not too much, because we don't want to belabor the point. But
well, and especially I think there's probably a lot of repeat listeners.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are loyal fans is what we call them.
Of course. And I sometimes hear some of the zingers and some of the funny things that we say, people say it back to me. So I'm like, oh, people are actually listening.
Yes.
Which is kind of funny. My name's Clinton Wilkins. I'm a mortgage broker in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Recently, I guess, crowned or awarded Mortgage Broker of the Year for across the country. And, we thank all our listeners here on CityNews, obviously in Halifax and in Ottawa, for listening to us, and for our viewers online, and anybody who's listening to us anywhere where you can get your podcast, on Spotify or Apple Music. I've been in the industry for 17 years. I funded over $1 billion worth of mortgages and almost 5,000 transactions, Todd. Can you imagine?
I cannot imagine.
Every time I think I've seen everything, I see something new.
And you know what's really pushed you over that edge? Were those 2 transactions you did with me.
Well,
without those, you would not be successful.
Those are my favorite 2 transactions. You know what I mean?
Well,
and probably no one outside of this industry knows more about mortgage lending than you do, Todd.
That's true, isn't it?
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
I'm sure, like at parties, when you go to a party, and maybe this weekend, you can just talk about mortgage lending and everything with the Bank of Canada and real estate.
That's right, because that's what everybody wants to talk about at a party.
Let me tell you, that's what I talk about. I don't know about you.
Speaking of parties, are you having another one this summer?
You know what? We're always having a little event.
But you had a big blowout last summer.
Oh, yeah. We had. I don't know if I can redo that one. For any of you who don't know, I had a big event here in downtown Halifax at our office. Yeah. We have a big terrace outside our office here on George Street. Yeah. We're right beside the Art Gallery and kitty corner to Province House. So a great location. And we had a seated event for about 50 of our closest business partners and staff and friends, and it was a great time.
It was fun.
And we got to host Todd and a couple of our other friends from CityNews, which was great. And we'd like to be able to do things like that. Obviously being self-employed, Todd, you've been self-employed in the past. You understand. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And that's why I think even a lot of the clients that we deal with every day who are self-employed, it holds a little bit bigger piece of my heart, because I know what some of the struggles are, but it's nice to celebrate some of those successes. Yeah, for sure. And, I think putting us on stage and just showing what we can do. Obviously, I really believe in Halifax and Nova Scotia. I think it's a great place to live and do work and live and work. And I think maybe some of our listeners in Ottawa might want to join us here on the East Coast at some point. And maybe, learn some interesting things about mortgage lending as well along the way.
To that, a lot of people have moved to this region from all other parts of the country, Ottawa and big cities. Is that still happening? Or is that kind of slowed a bit?
I think there's been less, migration here than there was maybe a year ago, Todd. That's a symptom of things opening up across the country. Obviously, things are getting more back to normal. Is COVID over? No. Are things getting more to a normal state? I think so. And I think that, we still have a very great life here. I think there's been some of the decisions by the provincial government that may be slightly less attractive for people wanting to relocate here. One of the things is, they announced increase to the property taxes, which was rolled back.
Yeah, they rolled it back.
There was going to be a 2% increase in the property taxes for any non-Nova Scotians that own property here. So that was rolled back. But they still have in place an increase in the D-transfer tax. So for non-residents who buy a property here and they're not going to live here within 6 months, they have to pay an increase in the D-transfer.
How much is the increase? I can't remember. It's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's double, Todd. Yeah, or it's 1.5%. And obviously, some municipalities have 0. Some have 1.5. Right. Like in Halifax, we have a 1.5% D-transfer tax already. So, that's an impact.
Yeah.
Is that the showstopper for people who want to buy properties here? Probably not. But it certainly would discourage some people. And I think having the scare on that property tax piece and that, 2% per, or $2 per $100 of the assessment, that was a significant kind of scare to some people. So I think that maybe slowed the market a little bit. And, in some markets from across the country, having the increase in what's going on in the rate environment right now, Todd, has impacted, our real estate market here. Maybe not so much, but in some other real estate markets, it certainly has had a big impact. And I think borrowers are becoming more cognizant of their cost of borrowing. And it's not just the cost of borrowing that's impacting Canadians. Inflation, when you go to the pump, it's costing more money. I can tell you groceries are much more expensive. And, the Bank of Canada really sent a clear message here last week about, what's going on out there in consumer goods and inflation. They sent a clear message to Canadians to stop spending and start saving their money. So
don't you find though that for Canadians this is such a contradiction when you're told throughout the pandemic that they want you to spend, entice you to spend, low interest rates, get out there and do that, and then all of a sudden flip the switch. No, we don't want you to do that. That's and I just find this kind of market manipulation by the bank is I don't know how I would describe it.
And would the Bank of Canada always get it right? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think they're always playing catch up a little bit. They acted very swiftly and quickly when the pandemic struck. So I do kind of applaud them to lowering that cost of borrowing. Yeah. Todd, they needed to put a liquidity into the marketplace. They needed to bring down the cost of borrowing.
Well, that's created all the inflation, though, has it not?
In theory, it did, because guess what? No one spent any money for 2 years.
That's right.
No one was, going on vacation, shopping.
Yeah, so now you get all this money
and
floating
Canadians
around.
Saved a lot of money, Todd.
Yeah, that's right.
So then, what happened? All this money that was being saved suddenly flooded the marketplace.
Yeah.
And that flood in the marketplace has obviously put a strain on consumer goods. It's really put a strain on, if you're building a home, the cost of materials are very expensive.
Vehicles.
There's no cars to buy.
Yeah, can't even rent cars.
You can't rent a car. The lease on my car is up in December, and I'm like, you know what? I might have to buy that car.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Then again, if you trade it in, and probably get a good value for it at this point as well.
You know
right?
what? I could trade it in, and I could walk away with a big fat check. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I wouldn't have a way to get around.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's not great. But the long story long of my explanation.
Yeah.
I think the migration to Nova Scotia has somewhat slowed over the last couple of months. But we have a lot more listings on hand than we did before. So I'm interested to see now what's going into the summer. Typically, June is a little bit of a quieter month for us. Obviously, kids are finishing up with school. We're getting ready for summer. And summer is not always the busiest time. But I think if we do have some more listings, it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Obviously, with the purchases, here in Halifax and across our region.
So what do you want to talk about over the next 3 segments?
I think that we're going to talk about what's going on with the Bank of Canada and what's going on with the rates. I know, obviously, if you're a consumer, if you're in the market, if you have a mortgage already, you're going to be interested to know kind of what's going on with the rates. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into that. What's better right now, a variable or fixed? We're also going to talk about refinance. Is the summer a good time to think about a refi? Why do people refinance?
Is there a season that's better than others?
I think
for refinancing?
I think the right season is the right season for you. So we'll talk about that a little bit and the mechanics on how a refinance works. And, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on here in the real estate market in Halifax.
And do you have any tips on what type of music we're going to be playing today? Kind of more rocking like we hear?
Well, last month, I don't know if our listeners remember, we had a whole ABBA theme.
Yes.
Now, you pick the first song.
Yes.
I'll pick the second song, so you guys can decide which song you like better.
All right, sounds good. Mortgage 101, your guide to home ownership. We'll be right back.